It is often said that sunshine is the best disinfectant. This saying suggests the power of this complex concept known as transparency. What is transparency, and why is it important in natural resources? What is required for transparency to be effective? These are the central concerns of this chapter. The literature defines transparency as a flow of relevant, timely, and reliable information. Information in the economic, financial, social, institutional, and political arenas, which is accessible to all relevant stakeholders. Public sector transparency requires that the state proactively, not reactively or defensively, provide such information. Transparency also demands that such disclosures are timely, reliable, they are relevant, they are fully accessible and understandable. Example, if the central bank issues a report, but it is much delayed, or it's very difficult to have access to, or it's hard to understand, or there are gaps, inaccuracies, there is information which is not very relevant, we can call this zombie transparency. Zombie transparency may at first look like what it is, a really useful disclosure is taking place, a report has come out. But as with zombies in the movies, closer inspection would reveal that it is not real life transparency, or worse, it may be misleading by obfuscating the actual reality. But then there may be disclosures associated with reports that are technically sound and with relevant information and data, but that still doesn't lead to increased accountability. These take place in many settings where there is far from free press or the civic space is being repressed, so that those using the data to make governments accountable and trying to analyze it or report about it, they do risk retribution or even jail. In some sense, these disclosures, without an enabling environment for accountability, is another case of zombie transparency. In fact, over the past decade, despite some advances in terms of disclosure of extractive revenues through EITI and other such initiatives, what has been happening is that civic space has been narrowing in many countries. There is increased suppression of civil society, of NGOs, of a free press. The evidence shows that the restricted civic space is a significant challenge, particularly in resource-rich countries, and particularly even more so in oil-rich countries. And this is fundamental, because progress in governance and development takes place by an open and concerted multi-stakeholder effort with key roles for the government, of course, for parliament, for civil society and the media, and for the private sector, including both multinationals and domestic companies. So transparency has to be complemented with accountability, with engagement by civil society and the other stakeholders. But even then, transparency, even with accountability, while absolutely necessary, may not fully suffice if rule of law is absent. Exposing the corrupt in places where impunity rules may be a first step, but there has to be sanction as well. Transparency is necessary, but on its own is insufficient. Now, does this mean that everything should be publicly disclosed? Let us then focus on natural resources in particular, asking which crucial types of transparency are expected and recommended. And let me start with what I call the transparency troika, which is now at the core of the new EITI standard. Troika here referring to addressing these three key questions about transparency and disclosures: the who, the what, and the how much. The who refers to knowing who the owners are, the what about the contracts, and the how much about the revenues. On the who, disclosing the actual beneficiary owners of the companies in the sector. Who is behind the deals? The aim there is to be fully transparent about who the ultimate beneficiaries of these companies really are, and including where there are politically exposed persons or PEPs in this. Again here, an illustration of the importance of complementing transparency. In addition For instance, there have to be conflict of interest rules making it illegal for public officials in the ministry to be owners in the sector. So it's transparency, but also the laws have to be there and be enforced. So that is about the who. Now about the what, the disclosure of contracts between government and extractive companies, as well as then the full disclosure of licensing bids, of allocations and awards, and the process and management governing them, as recently instituted by the oil regulator, CHN, in Mexico. Then on to the how much, the transparency related to the payments the companies make to governments, which is very useful for analysis and accountability, but they need to be disaggregated project by project for each company and country. If the data is not disaggregated to the project level, corruption or transfer, mispricing, or underpaying government can be hidden. And at the community level, they will not know how much revenue was generated in their own projects in their soil. With this troika of transparency, one can then begin to triangulate the data and figure out whether the payments reported match what should have been expected according to the contracts, and review whether the ownership of the company raises any flags. There are also other absolutely key disclosures in this sector, which we are also pursuing in NRGI and in EITI. This relates to frontier areas such as social and environmental assessments. And equally important is to have financial and corporate governance information on the oil and mining state-owned enterprises, as well as on the natural resource funds, or sovereign wealth funds, as they are called in many countries. Without transparency in these dimensions, opacity in extractive is perpetuated, and so are the corruption risks. Opacity, as opposed to transparency, also confers selected access to inside information to some politicians, where may be engaged with companies and to selected companies at the expense of the public good and to everybody else in society. Particularly in a sector with such valuable and concentrated wealth, such as oil and mining, this increases the risk of elite capture, the influential few benefiting privately from the huge rents derived from the nation's wealth that instead should benefit all citizens. Transparency is an important antidote to such elite and state capture, particularly if complemented with accountability and rule of law. In this context then, very important tools have been developed, including by us with partners and others. One is the Natural Resource Charter and its own benchmarking tool, which are discussed in other sessions. And then there is the Resource Governance Index, for which there is also a dedicated separate session with much more detail. The results of the 2017 index are actually rather sobering. Of these 81 assessed countries, less than 20% came out with having satisfactory quality of transparency and accountability. The rest had much more significant challenges, including a number of them exhibiting an acute governance crisis in the sector. The good news is that this 20% that shows, yes, it can be done, the challenge can be addressed. Those countries, in fact, that are performing include quite a few emerging economies, particularly in Latin America, but also in Africa and other regions. Conversely, some very rich countries, such as a few in the Gulf, are performing rather poorly. There is also a very significant variation within a country. Some do better in the oil sector than in mining, some vice versa. Some do better in revenue management than in licensing or taxation, some the other way around. To make progress at the country level, it is important to analyze the country details and figure out the areas where progress is still pending. Moving now to a mention on companies, which are just so important in this sector, particularly the large multinationals, let me note that there is some progress as mentioned regarding some oil companies like Cosmos, Tullow Oil, and Statoil, which have paved the way on disclosing revenues in detail. And now, thanks to the EU directives and UK and also in Canada, more companies are disclosing. very much in contrast to US big oil companies which are not disclosing. In mining, there is also progress on these disclosures, mandated by the same legislation. Yet, there is still a lot of progress needed from the companies in terms of transparency, not only big oil in the US, but more generally in terms of contract disclosure, for instance. So let me conclude now with three overarching points. The first one is that transparency is absolutely necessary, but on its own is insufficient. It has to be complemented with civic space, with accountability, with rule of law. Second, the issue of transparency is absolutely critical in natural resources, and the devil is in the concrete details. And lastly, the new set of tools, like the Resource Governance Index and initiatives like the EITI and others, are very promising, and all of these are helping make inroads. But all of these need to be further used and strengthened and complemented by other efforts. Thank you very much.